Two books have just been published which remind us of the fascinating relevance of St. Augustine, who died 20 years after the Visigoths conquered Rome, which was back even before the Vietnam War. One of these is purely and simply, a new translation of Augustine's Confessions under the title Love Song. Why Augustine? Asks Dr. Sherwood Wirt, a congregational minister, editor of Decision magazine, author of a half-dozen books. Why would an American journalist undertake to translate from the Latin something written 1,500 years ago by a Catholic bishop in Africa? The reason is that I love him. Or can't you say that anymore? I am saying it because he has done a beautiful thing in my life. He has shared his struggles and his search for God with me, and has done it without sacrificing a first-class intellect, without trying to polish his image, and without stooping to religious cliches. Gerhard Niemeyer's exciting political and philosophical book, Between Nothingness and Paradise, addresses itself to the total critique of society so popular with the New Left, and explores the critical work of St. Augustine, whose total criticism of Roman society is not to be confused with a total criticism of the world. Professor Niemeyer, an Episcopalian, is professor of politics at Notre Dame. This is also his sixth book. He has taught at Princeton, Yale, and at the National War College, having left Germany in the 30s in protest against Adolf Hitler. Lest these Protestant gentlemen should slip into heresy, we have another fan of St. Augustine, Bishop Fulton Sheen, who, when he last appeared on Firing Line, had just published his 60th book. Bishop Sheen is less well known for his dazzling academic accomplishments than for his public and popular evangelism. I should like to begin by asking Dr. Wirt whether he believes that it is possible readily to understand Augustine's Confessions in a secular age.
Yes, I'd like to just make sure that I don't get racked up before my church. I am a Presbyterian, not a congregational minister. I think that Augustine is one of the most relevant of the ancients for our day, simply because he was probably one of the most honest men of the ancient world. They say he was the first psychologist. And the way he describes his inner life in his search for God, to me, is one of the most captivating and revealing sequences in the history of literature.
Well, now, would you say that the steps that he went through are exactly such steps as one might currently need to go through in order to achieve that state, or were there environmental factors there or historical factors that would make his particular progression extremely unlikely?
Well, of course, everyone has to come to God in God's way, and God is a God of infinite variety, so everyone comes in a different way. But I will say that Augustine's experiences seem strangely parallel with our own. For example, when he was an adolescent, he was a juvenile delinquent. When he got to secondary school, then he got in with a gang called the Overturners, which sounds very familiar today. He didn't go along with everything they did, but was quite friendly with them. And so he graduated from that and went on to become a teacher. He got fed up with the attitude of the classroom. And there's so many things that seem to be related to our time.
Well, what is it that what is it that made the Confessions such an arresting spiritual document then, and what is it that in your judgment has kept it so very much alive through the centuries, especially since it was written in a language that nobody much knows anymore?
Bishop Sheen knows it.
He knows everything.
I think that the man's basic quality was his transparency. He just put it down the way it was. He even started with his infancy, and the way he described his childhood, as he says, by observing how other infants acted, is most revealing and very acute and perceptive. Then he comes to his boyhood, and he asks questions about discipline. Why does a child have to be beaten? Why can't he be attracted to learning? And then he goes on into his boyhood, and he, of course, talks about some of the pranks that he got into. And in each case, he analyzes his behavior, and he talks to God about it. The whole thing is directed to God, not to a reading audience. But in the process, he comes through with very clear observations about how God was working in his life all the time that he was getting into these scrapes, and giving him guidance by, in some cases, just turning him over to the results of his own behavior.
Well, Bishop Sheen, have you, in your experience with the Confessions, found that it has an anticipatable impact on everybody who reads it, or do some people not understand it? Does it have an impact on everyone who reads it?
I think so, first of all, because it is entitled Confessions. And everybody is interested in confessions. And it might be well to point out that really in literature there are two kinds of confessions. There's the confession of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the confessions of St. Augustine. But there's a world of difference between the purpose. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote his confessions in order to produce in us the same emotional feeling and sensations that he had. St. Augustine did not concentrate on his wounds. He concentrated on the physician. So if one looks to him to find a long sex story, though his life was a sex life, and I wonder if a good title wouldn't, this is an awful thing to tell you now, would have been Under 30, because it's the story of a man up until he's 30 years of age. But though his life was that, his early life, yet he doesn't often mention it. He talks in symbols. You would expect something very sensational about the way he stole, but it's a pear. Out of all of the things that he took, he just chooses a pear. And this stands as a symbol in order to prove that he didn't need the food. And the only reason for stealing was just to rebel and to have the pleasure of stealing.
Well, excuse me, Bishop, but it was a whole load of pears.
Oh, was it?
And it was a whole gang, a group of fellows who went out on a prank one night and stripped this tree, and then took all the pears and threw them at the hogs. And then he spends several pages describing this and then asking why did he do it. And he finally came to the conclusion that the reason he did it was because of the fellowship that he was in, that he never would have done it by himself. And so he brings out the collective nature of sin.
But he also uses this particular deed as an example for the evil, for evil as such, because here was not even a benefit which he derived. It was just doing something, you might say, for the evil of it. And this, he became aware to the evil in man because of this. It seems to me that what makes this book so tremendously relevant is you look over, take besides the Confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, take also ancient autobiographies, and you have here a completely novel type. Here is the individual soul before God, seeing himself, his whole life, and his coming to be what he is before the eyes of God. And this whole situation of understanding one's life before God, this is a modern man at the same time. This is the individual. And the individual is a modern man. You might say that Jean-Jacques Rousseau would not have been possible without Augustine, except that he made a mess of it.
Well, when you say that he was perhaps the first psychiatrist, you had reference to what? To the nature of his introspection, or the extent to which he came up with categories of observations which are now identified in modern psychological vocabulary, or what?
Observation of his own behavior and the way he analyzed his behavior. For example, that pear incident would be, I think, a perfect description of vandalizing, let's say, of a high school today. Why would somebody want to go into a high school and strip it and destroy it and dump the books on the floor and so on. If you read Augustine's book 4, you will find him explaining it. They did it for the hell of it.
You should explain that book 4 is probably 300 words, so
yes.
They'll make it sound like a library that they have.
Well, yes, it's a chapter, actually.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Niemeyer, in your book, you talk really about how the whole, what is nowadays understood as alienation, is really not only a psychological but also a political discovery of his. Do you want to explain what you mean by that?
Yes. Well, the psychological and the political, they penetrate each other in Augustine. And it seems to me that precisely having seen his own life before God, he was able to penetrate many more layers than hitherto. And his psychology consists in this many-layeredness of the human being. There is not only the knowledge, and there are not only the emotions, there is at the deepest layer the will, and then there is this curious relation of the body and the soul, which he says has been perverted because of our fallen nature, so that now the body has command over our soul, even though we don't want it to have command and so on. So the insight in these particular problems, now it was an insight into this problem also, which made him realize that man ultimately is not at home, not wholly at home, in any political society. That any political society that we might invent, even the best one, has flaws and falls far short both of absolute justice and of absolute freedom and goodness.
And that it must be so.
And it must be so because of man's fallen nature. Now, that doesn't mean that any of these societies has no good in it, but he says they fall far short of what man's ultimate home is. And so man tends beyond history to a perfection which cannot be his in history.
Only on the 8th day.
Only on the 8th day, beyond time.
Well, does a lack of an understanding of this correspondence in history and in human society of the flawed nature of man, is that responsible in your judgment for many of the raging misunderstandings of our time?
Yes, oh yes, indeed. It is, you might say, the guarding of man in our time, the divinization of man, the claiming of divine rank for man. Man is seen as his own savior. Man is seen as the absolute master of nature. Man is seen as the absolute master of history. And wherever that is the case, this perspective of Augustine's, you know, so everything in the light of God, man in the light of God, man is at home with God and is restless until he comes to rest in God. And if this perspective is lost out of sight, then the tremendous faults and mistakes which we see in our time follow logically.
It seems to me that he's saying that the basic sin of man is pride. That this was the original sin. And one of the most beautiful aspects of the Confessions is where he talks about Jesus Christ, because the first thing he mentions about him is his humility, his meekness, and that he sets an example for us of how to walk lowly before God. And if he was meek, how much more meek we should be. And time and again, this comes through, that he was on his way to be a great, eloquent lawyer. He was on his way right to the top. He had the finest brain of his time. There were only two men in the ancient world that are considered finer minds than Augustine, Plato and Aristotle.
As fine, you mean?
Equal to him, that's right. And this man was on his way right up to the ladder of empire. And then when God got hold of him finally, and he began to realize who he was, then the example of Christ humbled him. And then he took the humble road. He no longer had ambition. He became a recluse and eventually a priest.
What is it that made him a saint, Bishop Sheen? I mean, by having a fine mind and being a great teacher doesn't make you a saint necessarily, does it?
No. As a matter of fact, that sometimes a great mind stands in the way. One of the great marvels of Thomas Aquinas is that, with being so very learned, he was so very saintly. And But you ask, what is it that makes a saint?
Oh, that made him a saint.
It made him a saint. It's making Christ lovable. I think that's it. And you see, he had to struggle with exactly the same thing young people have to struggle against today. We get hung up on words that he had to use, like Manichaeanism. Well, it meant there were two sources, one of good and one of evil. But really what he was doing, he was battling with the problems that the young people are battling with today, namely determinism. Have I any freedom? Is there such a thing as guilt? And one of the reasons Augustine liked, I'll not call it Manichaeanism, but this new doctrine, was simply because it was no longer culpable. And it would be just exactly like a young person today saying, I'm going to follow Marx because we are economically determined. I'm going to follow Freud because I am biologically and prenatally determined. So Augustine said, I'm going to follow Manichaeanism simply because I am determined historically by the ages. And thus he had no guilt.
Yeah, but then he rejected Manichaeanism. But why is it that when he rejected that and came back to the kind of Christianity with which we are familiar, he nevertheless described a doctrine about which it was recently said Augustine's last completed treatises drew out the logic of predestination to its most ruthless conclusions. Though his doctrine in its final form was never accepted by the Church, it appeared virtually unmodified in both Aquinas and Calvin. Now, how could he have rediscovered freedom if at the same time he was putting forward predestination?
Well, he discovered freedom, first of all, by discovering the will. Mm-hmm. Isn't that right, Dr. Wirt? Because, you see, even today in school, we are emphasizing only the intellect. We are filling brains full of knowledge. Well, when you just educate the mind, the intellect, you can really raise a race of learned devils instead of stupid ones. Character is not in the brain. Character is in the will. It is in my choices. It's in motivations. And see, today there's no training of the will. About the only place that the discipline is left today is at West Point, Annapolis professional football field.
Mm-hmm. Well, might Augustine have been saying in his rejection not only of Manichaeanism, but of Pelagianism, that in fact, whether you developed a will was a decision that other people, to wit God, was making in your behalf. And under the circumstances, it isn't particularly useful to bestir yourself.
No, I think Augustine, in answer to that, would probably have said, just as a boy would be prompted very much to become a doctor by the influence of his father and the kindness of his father in the medical world, without the father ever saying a word. So we are drawn, sweetly fortiter et suaviter, strongly and sweetly, and determined by our responses to this grace.
One of the most amusing parts of the Confessions is where he's describing his languor and his reluctance to listen to God. God kept knocking on the door of his heart, and he would say, "Save me, Lord, but not yet. Let me have a little more fun first." And he said, "In a little while." But he said the little while grew to be an awful long while. And he still was hung up on the matter of his will. Intellectually, he had become convinced, under the teaching of Ambrose, as it indicates in the book, that Ambrose had sold him on the gospel. He was now convinced that Jesus Christ was his Savior. He was convinced that the gospel was true, the Bible was true. The scripture had been interpreted to him by Ambrose in such a way that he could now accept it. But he was still hung up on his will.
And the tremendous way in which he developed this, it seems to me, is when he describes the extravagances of his youth and speaks about his sexual life and so on, and then says, it is not the body, not the flesh that is wicked. The wickedness is in the soul, thereby reducing everything to the will. It is the wrong-directed will which is the source of the evil in us. So that at this point, the decision falls one way or the other. and that is also where evil springs.
Well, after he wrote the Confessions, as I guess most people know, he went on to become a very active bishop of Hippo. Was he, by the way, a black man?
He was a Berber in all probability, which doesn't make him a black man.
Yeah.
But
his mother has a Phoenician name, Monica, and they think that she may have come from Palestine, or at least her ancestors, which would make him possibly Hamitic.
Well, he became then not only a successful bishop in the sense of one who administered a large area, but also he kept working, did he not, on his great political treatise, which is in a sense a counterpart of the Confessions, isn't it? At least if you call that a
As a matter of
human
fact, you can still see that. You know, the book is written in such a way that you can see he probably dictated one morning, and then other business intervened, and then 3 months later he said, well, now is a good time to take up the city of God again. And it says to the secretary, where were we? And the secretary says here and there, and he reads the last lines, and Augustine says, oh yes, now I remember. And then he resumes again the thoughts which were at the end of the last chapter, which are now at the beginning of the first chapter. Then he goes on for a while, and the book is composed this way over a period of 12 years.
Now, what are the contributions of the City of Man to the contemporary understanding of the division of authority between religious authority and civil authority?
Well, the main and biggest contribution, it seems to me, is what we call today the limited state. If you look, for instance, in Plato and Aristotle, the state is everything. The state has the full authority over everything in the life of man, and all the good is expected from the state. And Augustine now, with this beautiful sense of proportion, says, no, the destiny of man is beyond the state. Man is destined for another company, for the company of the communion of the saints, for the company of the city of God. And ultimately his destiny is not fulfilled until he rests in God. In the meantime, the state is a useful institution and a good, but not the ultimate good. And so he took the state down quite a notch and made it quite clear from then on out, for all times, for us too, that the state is not the fulfillment of our ultimate destiny, which is the basis of the limited state.
Well, is it safe to say that Lincoln could never have uttered the words he did at Gettysburg save for Augustine?
That's right, yes.
And that the whole constitutional Western system
Yes.
has roots there.
With its drawing of bounds to state power and to state function, and there's something beyond the state, which is man's destiny, man's essence, and that is beyond. Yes.
I'd like to bring up a matter of the state's authority, and a touchy matter that he brings out that I can't find anyone talking about today, and that is his contrast between flagitia and facinora. Bishop will know those words, but as I understand it, facinora are the crimes that people commit against society and which should be punished. But there is another offense, which he calls flagitia, and this is the crime of a man against himself. This is the man who commits an offense against nature, the man who destroys his own personality by abusing himself.
And he says he should be punished also.
And this man should be stopped. He should not be permitted to destroy himself, he said. And that this is the state's job as well.
This is pretty risque talk, isn't it, in the current situation, to suggest that there is a natural law which it is the responsibility for the civil authority to assert. I mean, that wouldn't get by nowadays, would it?
It's unpopular.
It's unpopular. That's one thing for it in its favor.
Yes.
I wonder, since you asked what is his contribution, let me add the other great contribution of Augustine. He was the first one to see history as an orderly whole, the first one to have a philosophy of history. And you might say it is because of Augustine that our civilization, the Western civilization, has at its very core a concept of history as a whole, of history as an orderly progression in time, as a meaningful progression in time, you might say. And you can go so far as to say our civilization must have such a view of history, and if it cannot have a good one, it will have a bad and perverted one.
Well, in his total rejection of Roman society, was he saying that Roman society was useful, that we've learned something from it, or was he saying we have to go back and adopt a complete other vision? In that sense, was he a radical, would you say, rather than a conservative who sought to build on what was left, even if it was mostly ashes?
He said both. First of all, he said Rome, the civilization of Rome was completely wrong. The Roman gods were unreliable, they were immoral. Roman life was based on wrong foundations, and if the end of Rome was the sack of Rome, the conquest in 410, then this is really what befits such a society. What would you expect if you start that way? This is what you get at the end.
Well, was he saying, Bishop Sheen, what you've often quoted Lincoln as saying, that the society earned doom, and that it was something that was visited as a result of the workings of Providence?
Yes, Lincoln said that he never feared that America would fall from without, but from within. And he analyzes, over these years that he wrote The City of God, the fall of Rome. In fact, he talks so much about it that his priests and his people used to say about him when he got up to preach, "Si tacia de Roma," if he would only shut up about Rome. and it was because, of course, this was tremendous. We have no idea. This was civilization falling. This wouldn't be like America falling or London. This is all civilization.
Or even London?
Or even London, yes, or even London. And so he was very much disturbed by it, but as Dr. Niemeyer says, that what he did bring was a philosophy of history, that after all the rise and fall of civilization is like a way of the cross. It's providentially leading somewhere. And he says somewhere in his Confessions, he said, in a painting, there are shadows. These shadows, he said, do not altogether make the picture, but they are essential for the picture. So too, he says, there will be a fall of civilization. There will be evil. He said, and yet it's necessary for the total picture. So he was, and after all, Toynbee picks up this philosophy of history. Toynbee has written how many? 4, 10, or 11 volumes on civilization. And he says that civilizations fall simply because they begin to morally deteriorate. And there's an anticipation of the fall of a nation.
Very interesting that the last defenders of Rome spoke German. The young men of Rome refused to go to war to defend their city.
Well, the Germans were also the masters of Rome.
Well, the Germans were part of the Roman legions. They were brought in to help defend the city. But the young men of Rome had decided that they would not defend the city. And so when the barbarians came in, they overran the place.
Why did the barbarians stop short of trying to extirpate Rome or Christianity? Why did they not? What was it? Does Augustine have an account? Does he account for that strange inhibition?
You mean in 410? As a matter of fact, they respected the asylum of the Christian churches.
Yes.
And if there was any mitigation in the sack of Rome, it was precisely of the presence
That's
of
why I
Christian
asked whether he
church and
accounted for
Christianity. No, he simply points this out, and he defended then Christianity against the charge that Rome fell because Christianity had been adopted and the old Roman gods had been abandoned. But you asked before whether he saw any usefulness in Rome. The order which Augustine saw in history was the order of the moments when God visibly intervened in history. Exodus of Israel, David, later on the Babylonian captivity, and later on, of course, the incarnation, yes. And he related the various empires to these moments: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, the Persian Empire. And he said, finally, also, it has pleased God to raise an empire in the West, which was the Roman Empire. And this also was related because it was under the Roman Empire that Christ was born and that Christianity arose and Christianity was adopted. So in spite of this tremendous criticism of which he leveled against Rome, Rome had a function in history. It was a function of the shadow, possibly. At any rate, it had a function in history, a necessary function. And one didn't pass Rome by. And then he went further even and said, look, as long as we have states in the world, one must make a distinction between better and worse states. And as long as you do make this distinction, the virtues of the Romans are still very highly recommendable virtues for having a good state, even though it isn't the ultimate good.
They just needed to be baptized.
That's right.
Well, in fact, the reformers were always talking about the virtues of ancient Rome. Calvin and Luther both extolled them without giving them the right of Christian baptism, you might say.
Well, now this order that he saw in history was not something that was to lead us, you just finished telling us, towards utopia, which suggests certain limitations in some of the reformist and utopian movements of today, i.e., he's certainly speaking to them. But was there, when you said it was a good order and that in the absence of any order at all, you're going to have a bad order, you mean good in what sense? Are things going to improve? Did he predict?
No, when I spoke of good order, I meant this. You brought up this business of utopia. The biblical word for that is millennium, the 1,000 years, the 1,000-year Reich. You know? And there is a passage in the Bible in the 20th chapter of the book of Revelation which speaks of the 1,000 years in which Satan will be bound and Christ will rule with his saints. Now, this is a passage which is open to all kinds of misinterpretation, particularly the misinterpretation, look, the 1,000 years will begin, let us say, in the year 1000, you see, and then will last, and this will be an era of perfect bliss in history. And Augustine, from the very beginning, said, no, don't interpret it that way. The millennium, the 1,000 years, is now, since Christ's death. Christ, in his church, is ruling with his saints. Don't look for a fulfillment of ultimate goodness in history. This will be beyond history. And the bad and perverted interpretations of history came around as soon as this counsel of Augustine was forgotten, and they began to interpret the Bible as predicting some kind of secular realm of bliss in history, beginning, let's say, at the year 1260 or whenever it was. See?
So I don't buy that.
Of course not.
Nor do I buy his extreme views on predestination. But that is not why I wrote a book about Augustine. I wrote a book about him because of the man's, what he did for me in revealing the nature of God to me and the mediation of Jesus Christ.
Excuse me.
Oh, no.
You know, what I find interesting in this new translation of yours, or in the Confessions, but you bring it out well in your translation, how relatively late in his conversion process Augustine came to the person of Christ. How very early the young people of today are coming, the Jesus people. Now take, for example, this new book by the Baptist minister in Los Angeles.
Hal Lindsey?
No, Blessed.
Oh, Arthur Blessed.
Arthur Blessed. I think he's one of the most remarkable men of God in this country. Here he's dealing, with prostitutes, dope addicts, alcoholics, murderers, in fact, the degenerates of civilization. He caters to them, he serves them. And sometimes in one night, they are completely changed. And he has dozens of instances. Now here's Augustine, however, who struggles over many, many years before he comes to the notion of a mediator. But the young people today, under the impact of a man like Blessed, what a wonderful name he's got, Blessed, under his impact, you see, they're coming at once, and genuinely. Then he has a halfway house for them, and he sends these young people out there for contemplation and discipline for a month.
I work for an evangelist, as you know, Billy Graham, and we are in continual contact with evangelical churches. And in our evangelical churches, one of the great cries, heart cry, is for revival. And we will, in our prayer meetings, we ask the Lord to send revival. Lord, send the Holy Spirit. Lord, revive our churches. And we need reviving. But the thing that impresses me is that while we're sitting in church praying for it, it's happening out on the street with men like Arthur Blessed. And this has been a great inspiration to some of us.
You make it sound as though it surprises you.
Well, Charles Whitney said, and this was told to me by C.S. Lewis when I interviewed him, he said, sometimes you have to build the altar in one place in order that the fire may come down in another place.
There is a passage in, in these confessions which if I may, I'd like to read. It's only two or three sentences, but I think it's an example not only of his style and also of your marvelous translation, but also and finally of how quickly he can penetrate to a subject. The question has arisen, why various parts of the Bible deal with various kinds of dislocations, and why some people are enslaved here and some people are free here, why there's more justice here and less of it here. He says, these things I did not perceive or understand at the time, though they battered my senses on every side. I failed to note them. I did not have the insight to discern the justice which is served by all good and holy men, contains in itself the principle of all it prescribes without any variation. Yet that same justice does not prescribe everything at once, but allots to each age what is appropriate to each. Thus, in my blindness, I blame those devout patriarchs of the Bible, not only for what they did during their lifetimes under the inspiration of God, but also for foretelling the future as God revealed it to them. It seems to me that there's something as numinous as that simply asserts its own importance, don't you think? Does that do to you what it does to me?
Yeah, when you were reading that, I was thinking of Newman. Newman said, I knew, but I did not know that I knew.
Yeah.
In other words, people do very often subconsciously know something is true, but they have not a reflex knowledge about it. And the reflex comes from some kind of introspection.
That is what led to Augustine's tremendous remarks about memory, when he says it was there in memory all the time. Only I didn't grasp
He was very much influenced by Plato, don't you think, and that in his dreams, yes.
And he wouldn't say that there is a blanket law that must apply to everyone. This is the point that you were bringing out in the passage that you read. But that in different times there have been different situations that have called for different manifestations of the law of God. But nevertheless, he goes back to the Ten Commandments, and he says, here is a general principle that applies everywhere, but it must be applied with wisdom and discretion in each age and to different peoples.
Mr. Tybee.
Yes, Dr. Word. Both you and Bishop Sheen said, in effect, that the hang-ups that Augustine felt were precisely the same that the kids today feel. Now, Augustine in his Confessions confessed to such crimes as that I know of: stealing pears, adhering to a system of concubinage, which was the reigning practice of the day, and of remaining as a rhetorician even after he'd been converted. How does the confession of these acts relate to the contemporary practices of, say, genocide, racism, or governmental fraud? I think we know that from the Time series. How does it relate to that?
He would take a very strong stand against injustice wherever he meets it. He spoke out against the cruelty of punishment, for example. And you won't find a racist line in Augustine. The man was from North Africa.
Yes.
And when he went to Rome, they picked his accent out right away and discriminated against him. If it weren't for his brilliant mind, he probably wouldn't have been appointed to the post in Milan as teacher of rhetoric. But I think that you won't find a clearer exposition of the nature of justice than you will in Augustine. Now, the man had his limitations. As he ran into the Donatist heresy, the Pelagian heresy, and so on, he was embattled. And I guess you could say that under the pressure, he recommended things.
Engaged in a little campaign rhetoric?
Yes, he did. And I think he was led, as many a leader has been led, under pressure to to positions which he normally would not hold. I think I could say.
So isn't it much easier, though, to steal a pear and confess it and then be saved than to commit a gross act, say, like genocide, confess that and then be saved?
I think you're making an unfair comparison. He was 14 years old in the pear incident.
All right.
And this led to...
No, he's asking you something different, I think, Dr. Wade. He's saying, look, he didn't, in fact, have the kind of tribulation which modern people do. It's one thing to confess a peccadillo like stealing a pear, but modern people, when they sin rather more grandly. Now, I happen to think he's wrong, but that is his question, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Well, I feel that Augustine would consider men capable of any kind of sin because of the nature of sin itself, the sin of pride, which, as he describes in the City of God, forces men into all kinds of oppressive actions against their fellow men. Now, if you say, does he condone this? No, he doesn't condone it. He considers this an offense, a stench in the nostrils of God.
But also, modern crime is really an aspect of technology.
No.
You couldn't have genocide
You may be missing that
in
too.
the 5th century.
It's not that he condones it. The question I'm asking is if the lesson of his confessions and of what happened to him can apply at all or relate at all to what's happening now.
Absolutely.
To grander crimes.
Absolutely.
I admit, of course, the grander crimes.
The sin of that he committed, as you say, the peccadillo, which he got into more sin than that, I can assure you, as his own statement will bear out. But the principle of judgment and condemnation which he applied to himself there, he would apply to any offense of man against man, man's inhumanity to man.
Do you think people are crueler now than they were
Byron
then?
said he taught me many new transgressions. So when you come to minimizing and restricting it to pairs, what were you going to say, Mr. Buckley?
Well, is there evidence that the cruelty of the 20th century is greater than the cruelty of the 5th century, or merely that it exercises itself more efficiently?
Oh, that'd be difficult. You're a historian. What would you say? Are we more cruel today?
No, I would say manifestly not. Manifestly milder. I also do not buy the premise of your question, because you already put your conclusions in what you assert in your question and then say, what about this, you see?
Yes.
And I would say, well, let's first examine the premises as a conclusion and see whether the conclusion is warranted. Now, as far as the evils of society is concerned, Augustine does indeed analyze them, and he analyzes them in the famous sentence in which he says, first of all, he says, my love is my center of gravity. And then he says, there are two loves in the world which are conclusive. One is the love of God, which says to God, you are the lifter up of mine head, you are my guide. And the other one is the love of self. And he attributes the evils which are spread through society, the litigation, the wars, the seditions, and so on, to this ubiquitous love of self, which always turns in on self and tries to fortify self, to enlarge self, to perpetuate self, to justify self. And that is where he sees all the evils. And I think Mr. Ward is quite right. No evil in society would have surprised him.
You know, in answer to your question, it gives me a second to think it over. I should say much less. When, for example, in history, was there a generation of young people who were more interested in social justice?
Right.
When was there a generation when they were so much concerned with nature under the problem of ecology? Very few past generations when they were so much distressed with phoniness as they are.
I'd like to ask, is the reason why this generation seems so concerned, is that because of the fact that we are better, or because the evils have become so exaggerated? Are we concerned about ecology because we are more aware, or because pollution has become so bad? Are we concerned about war because we have become better human beings, or because war has become so terrifically destructive?
I would say one of the principal reasons are the media of communications.
That's right. It's because...
Believe me, why are we buying the popularly advertised brands? Why does the government say there's no nourishment in this food, and it's increased its sales in the last few months?
In the 30 Years' War, 2/3 of the population of Germany were exterminated. Now, is there any war of our time which can even attain the magnitude of such losses?
I think the difference isn't as to the war that is being committed, but the potential. The 30 Years' War certainly was a tremendously destructive war. So was the 100 Years' War between England and France. But when in history did men know of the firepower that we possess today? I mean, today you talk about overkill. A Russian general, several years ago, wrote that if America and Russia had a nuclear war, they could obliterate every living thing in Western Europe. This, I don't think, occurred to the minds of men then. And when you're talking about Augustine, you're talking about
Genghis Khan. It occurred to Genghis Khan.
Did it?
Genghis Khan.
Did it really?
Oh, yes, indeed. I mean, he went out in his wars to obliterate population.
I disagree.
So he had it in his power, and it occurred to him.
I do not think his basic motivation was to obliterate populations.
No, but this occurred, not his basic motivation, but this was the mode of his warfare.
Also, too, I think an important point that I'm afraid I haven't expressed is the fact that we can obliterate populations in such a short time. Genghis Khan would have taken a lifetime to do what could be done today in an hour.
You know what Augustine would have said to that? He would have said, it doesn't make any difference how concerned you are, and how concerned the young people today are about problems of ecology or genocide or whatever. You won't do a thing about it until the love of Jesus Christ is shed abroad in your heart. And he would say, until you understand that the citadel of yourself, your pride, has got to be captured, and that the love of Christ has got to command your personality and dominate your behavior, until that happens, your generation isn't going to do any better than ours, and it'll do worse because it's got more equipment to do it with. And so he says, when Christ commands and reduces your pride and takes over your personality and makes you a humble man or woman who is going to walk with your fellow men, love your fellow men, and love your God, then, he says, there's going to be a chance to work out some of these questions.
In other words, the UN won't necessarily do it, huh?
No, but that doesn't mean we want to discontinue the UN.
Ms. Shelton.
Are you saying, Dr. Wirth, therefore, that all the youth should wait until everyone proclaims Jesus Christ and let all the problems go rampant? And until we do proclaim Jesus Christ, that everything else can just go to waste or just wait? Don't you think that it would take quite a long time? In the meantime, we're supposed to just sit back and let everything go loose and not do anything about it? Because if we don't proclaim Jesus Christ, it won't be in a very effective job?
The matter is not a matter of proclaiming Jesus Christ, it's a matter of receiving Jesus Christ and letting him control our attitude.
Okay, then receiving Jesus Christ, and then in reference to my question.
And when this happens, then, and I'm not speaking denominationally here, I'm just speaking about everybody, that when this happens, then you begin to want peace and not just domination, because as long as we're without him.
She admits that if everyone were influenced by Christ, the world would be different. But she's asking, should people who do not understand Christ or are not moved by him, ought they to do nothing, or should they recognize certain secular imperatives to try to do something about it?
Actually, what I'm questioning is the period of time. Are we supposed to wait until youth accepts, receives, proclaims whatever, Jesus Christ or his message, and not do anything about ecology, war, pollution, anything like that?
No.
Are you saying that we would be more reinforced in our move?
For example, when the missionaries would go to an island, let's say 100 years ago, the first thing he did when he landed on the beach was to open a dispensary and a clinic and start ministering to the people's needs. And there are needs today that need to be met. The pollution of our lakes has to be dealt with now, naturally, not by outside of the legal process, but through the...
But you just said that we should receive Jesus Christ, and before we can do an effective job of controlling or improving or whatever these problems.
That's right, because he will bring love into the situation.
But in the meantime, what are we supposed to do? before everyone accepts or receives
Well, you're
his
supposed to
message.
start with yourself, with number one.
I think our questions are pointing up to a broader issue, perhaps an anxiety, a rigor that the technology has outrun the lessons of Augustine and St. Paul, people who converted in an older time, at another time, when devastation was a little bit slower, when the pace was a little bit slower, when things weren't quite as hectic. And this is the anxiety. I understand there are Jesus people, Jesus freaks, I think they're called. But I don't think that they can be representative of the entirety of youth. Not at all, because there are just too many things that have to be dealt with secularly and waiting for Jesus to come, or looking for Jesus in the same way that Augustine or St. Paul did.
May I be allowed to say a word to this?
Sure.
Your remark is very much to the point, but let us then, first of all, remember what Augustine would have said to it and see whether this isn't applicable and true. He would have said, what kind of love is at the bottom of such an endeavor as you describe? And he would have said, if it isn't the love of God, then it is most likely going to be the love of self. And this love of self is then going to dress up itself in a social mantle which will make it appear hallowed, which will make it appear sanctified.
It might only be the survival instinct. That's love of self, isn't it? And we're at the desperate
No,
point
because it doesn't appear in a survival action. It appears in the form of a crusade against others, you see. This is what communism is. You have here a cause which says, we are going to save the world. We, the communists, we are the hallowed cause. We are the saviors. We are a special people. Therefore, we and the rest of mankind are not in the same boat. We are above them. There's something of this kind in every social cause which sets itself up as a kind of salvation. And it is likely to do that if it sees secular salvation without the love of God.
Mr. Harvey.
Now, you just brought up the point about communism as a crusade. And we're saying that we must seriously proclaim within ourselves, but also share with others Christianity. Now, the great attempt for mankind to create in himself, believed he was creating himself, and to share Christianity was the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages created the Crusades. They created the extermination of thousands of people in southern France to extirpate the Albigensian heresy.
And your question is?
My question is, don't you believe that if mankind accepted Christianity again with a fervor, he would simply pervert it to his own social uses and use it to create more evil rather than good?
You want to answer that, Bishop Sheen?
Well, first of all, yes, we've had Christianity in the world for 2,000 years, and there have been many, many fatalities because men have not been truly Christian. We've had water for 4 billion years, and there are a lot of dirty necks in the world. And then as regards priorities, it is not necessary for everyone to become converted to Christ before there is a social or economic revival. Christianity really works in the mass through a minority. It started with 12 men, not the type of 12 men who would lead a war against the Albigenses, but as 12 men who were fully devoted to Christ and ready to die for the sake of him and neighbor. It takes only a few, just as it takes only the few young people in a university who want something done. Do not wait until they get in touch with all of the university students of the United States before they take some action. They consider themselves a core. And the real Christians are becoming fewer and fewer. And believe me, it's not very easy to be a Christian. And it's not just a simple commitment just to the person of Christ. It's getting rid, it's the use of a sword. After all, God hates peace in those who are destined for war. And he said the kingdom of heaven is won by violence. He didn't ask, and the violence is what kind? There are two kinds of violence. There's a violence against neighbor, there's a violence against self. And what Dr. Niemeyer was talking about against egotism. See, is this terrific violence against self, in which the sword doesn't flash out as Peter's sword, and the best he can do as a swordsman is to hack off the ear of a fisherman. The sword is something that cuts into oneself and gets rid of pride and covetousness and lust and anger and envy, gluttony and sloth. And if we could get enough men, for example, in New York City, to be this kind of man, or this kind of woman, we could change it, just as the same way as this man we were talking about, Dr. Blessed, is doing it with these poor, unfortunate young people in Los Angeles. So there's no question of what priorities there are going to be. It's really a question of much in little.
Well, Miss Niemeyer, how would you handle this indictment of the Middle Ages? Bishop Sheen, I think, has effectively coped with the idea that you can't wait for everybody, that you can lead the way, and others will be inspired by your example. But is it not true that the Middle Ages was probably more positively identified with quotes Christianity than any other time, and yet there were institutional horrors, certain of which Mr. Harvey mentioned a few. How do you handle that? Simply that it was a perversion of genuine Christianity, or what?
There was no love. If there's no love, there's no Christianity. It's as simple as that. And let me ask you if it isn't true that if Hitler had been overcome and won by love instead of the hate that he carried in his heart against the Jew and against lots of other people, if this wouldn't have affected a lot of this genocide attempt that was made during World War II.
I think that if Hitler really possessed that love, he would not have been filled with the motivation to dominate an entire people. And this, I think, is part of the problem, not only with Christianity and with other sects. It's its essential goodness, but it's also the problem with it. It's based on love. And a single person can have love, and he can subvert his ego. But when he does this, he tries just to be himself and be friendly with others. When he wants to try to control and determine the destiny of society, he always seems to lose this love. It's a quality of man. And that's why when you try to make Christianity a mass movement, I think it becomes inevitable that inherent human evils are going to creep into it, and the love will be lost.
Well, I think you're very close to what is correct. I wouldn't say a mass movement, because it can be that without being organized, and it has been that. But you can say if you try to make Christianity into political order, it is not going to do away with all evils, because the evils remain there, and they have to do with the whole structure of political order. We spoke before about that. And what you have in the Middle Ages is a society in which more people were Christians than before, and the stamp of Christianity was in all parts of the society. And I would say about Mr. Word.
Thank you, Mr. Word. Thank you very much, Bishop Sheen. Ladies and gentlemen of the panel, thank you very much.
For a printed copy of this program, send 25 cents in coin, no stamps please, to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. That's 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. This program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service.